The book that I read and reviewed was Not Light But Fire: How to Lead Meaningful Race Conversations in the Classroom by Matthew R. Kay. So, an introduction to Not Light But Fire. First off, it was published in 2018. So, it brings up a lot of current day issues and describes how these issues could be addressed in the classroom. Some of the examples that were brought up, especially in just the introduction section of this book, include the Trayvon Martin case that happened a few years ago. If you guys aren't aware, Trayvon Martin was an innocent black man who was killed in his neighborhood for just walking down the street wearing a hoodie because he looked shady to the person who killed him. The person was later not found guilty for it, and it caused a lot of issues in his town, and especially even it spread throughout the entire United States, just because he was an innocent black man walking down the street and he was killed because of it. And then the book also describes excerpts from speeches President Obama gave during and before his presidency, that just talks about a black man in politics and how he has faced his own issues as far as race goes. And then the third point that I have right here is that the author mentions about how we talk about white supremacy a lot, but we never really talk about black rights or how black people feel about these issues. An example of this is that, like, in the news and everything, we see a lot about like a KKK rally that might happen, or a few years ago there was a big uproar because Confederate statues were being taken down in southern states because they were extremely racist, and there's no need for us to remember a time in which our country did all of these awful things to African Americans. But there was all of this tension about it, and people were so upset about it. All of this was going on. We never once talked about how African Americans felt about this issue at all. And that's something that I'm sure a lot of students wanted to talk about, especially if they were in the classroom near where this stuff was happening. It was affecting their day-to-day lives, and they wanted to talk about it. And some teachers just really weren't aware of how to lead these conversations, especially if they were not from diverse backgrounds at all. I know for me, I'm a middle class student. I come from a very suburban town. I went to private school from K through 8. So I personally really haven't faced a lot of diversity or really anything, and I haven't faced much oppression because of my race, because I'm white. So if I was in this situation, I wouldn't even know what to talk about either. So this book is really great for any educator to just prepare them, give them some insight and input for what to really talk about during these discussions. And then the book in general got its title from a speech that Frederick Douglass gave in 1852. Frederick Douglass, he was a former slave, and this speech, we talked about, the speech was it was around the 4th of July, and the people who set it up and kind of prompted Frederick Douglass to give the speech told him that he should talk about how we need to shed light on this country's race problem. But then Douglass later on describes in his speech, after he goes on, he talks about it, it's not a light that is needed, but a fire. And that is very interesting because he really wanted to show that it's not just a small light we need to shed on this race issue, but we really need to expand it. We need to put a fire to it so that everybody can see what is going on and how we can fix it and what we can do about it. Another point during this is that Americans really never move on to the next conversation, but we really tend to focus on like the one that has happened in the past. And that's something that we just really need to kind of work on and focus on. And because those things get people upset, but if we focus on the future and what we can do to change, we can make the change, but we're too focused on the past that the change isn't going to happen by focusing on that. We need to look at what we can do for the future and not just what has happened in the past. The book in general is structured for readers to understand how teachers and students can use this discussion in order to face conversations in the classroom. So the book is structured, it is from a teacher's perspective. The author is a teacher, so he uses a lot of personal insight from different things that he's done in his classroom to show how to lead these conversations. He really sets teachers up for the conversations, kind of coaches them through by giving these different real life examples of how to do that. So speaking of the author, here's the author, Matthew R.K. When Matthew was a student in elementary school, high school, he attended the Philadelphia public schools. Those are relatively diverse, as he explains. And then he later went on to receive a master's degree in educational leadership from California University of Pennsylvania. So he's very qualified to talk about this topic. He knows exactly what he's talking about. And then after his master's degree, he was a founding teacher of the Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which gave students the opportunity to use science and build their leadership skills in the classroom and then apply those to outside of the classroom. And then he's also the founder of the Philly Slam Club. I had no idea what this was before this, never heard of it. But the Philly Slam Club, it's a nonprofit organization that shows young people the power of their voice through speech competitions. This is one of the first slam poetry leagues that's ever been brought up in the Philadelphia area. There's a lot of like open slam poetry nights and whatnot, but nothing really for young people at all. And it's important to have something like this for young people because slam poetry is such a powerful thing that a lot of people use to really describe emotions, and you can describe a variety of emotions just by doing this. So I think this is a great thing that he did, and he definitely has been trying to bring students out to talk about sensitive issues by doing this, and I really commend him for that. He's also a strong believer in having mindful race conversations in the classroom. Clearly, that's why he wrote the book. And he also designs professional development programs to make teachers better facilitators. Kay believes that any teacher can really be a great discussion leader just by practicing discrete skills that shape the way that lead and facilitate discussions. He thinks that any teacher, no matter the background, can really do this. And by reading this book, it gave me a great insight into that. And I feel like every teacher should have that background knowledge before doing what they want to do. Especially no matter what school you're teaching in, but especially if you're teaching in a diverse school and don't really come from that background and don't have much knowledge on it. It's important because students are going to want to talk. That's what kids want to do, especially like middle school, high school level. Once they start hearing stuff on the news, they want to talk about it with their peers and teachers, and this can be great things to be incorporated into different lessons. So now here's a summary of kind of what was going on in the book, what everything the author talked about. He spent a good portion of the book just really outlining how and what meaningful conversations look like and kind of how to set up the space for that. So I'm going to start off with just what does a meaningful conversation look like. First off, it's really fostering these safe spaces. And safe spaces involve listening patiently, actively, and using police voice. Safe spaces for children. We need to take steps in order to have students develop the intimacy, vulnerability, and forgiveness, because these are not just things that are going to develop naturally. We really need to develop these conversations and not just declare the start of one. Because especially in classrooms, like you're not going to be able to be like, okay, let's talk about this today. Oftentimes you're really going to, a student might even just bring it up and you're going to have to take that and you can run with it however you want to. But it's important to be able to foster these safe spaces so students can bring up what they want to bring up. The the whole listen patiently part, something like that is where students are all sitting down. They're really listening patiently to their peers as they're talking. They're not having their hand in the air, waiting for their turn to talk, and not really listening to their peers. And they should really not be interrupting. They should really just be listening patiently to their peers. This active listening, this can be enforced by using positive reinforcement when students are doing the whole active listening concepts. So active listening is really when students are feeding off their peers' discussions. They're not just bringing up random points every now and then. They'll go, oh, I really like what Johnny said. I want to add to that by saying blah, blah, blah. Or, I understand why Johnny was saying this, but I kind of think this about it. And that'll lead a conversation where students will be able to come up with their own conclusions on a topic without the teacher having to facilitate that. But the student can facilitate it by using the positive reinforcement, like I said earlier. So just really commending students for building off of each other, saying, oh, I really like that you brought up that point. Does anyone have something they want to add to that or something like this? And just redirecting conversation as well for teachers, just to bring up new ideas as the conversation goes on. And the third section of this, the police voice, it really looks, there's two parts to it kind of. So the first part is students directing comments to each other and not the teacher. So if somebody says something, the student comments on that and directs it to that student who they're commenting on, versus looking at the teacher and saying, well, when Johnny said this, they did blah, blah, blah. But instead like, hey, Johnny, I like this point that you brought up and whatnot, stuff like that. And the second part is just having students speak in like the clear, expressive manner. Students, this topic of conversation really shouldn't be something that's forced at all. It should come very natural, and students should want to contribute. You shouldn't force students to contribute if they don't want to, but when they do, they should be speaking in that clear, expressive manner to each other. And then I have this quote right here. This quote's something that I found very interesting, and I thought it really brought in a lot of good points to this section. So the quote is, safe communities once established need to be maintained just like cars. Too often we take students immediately on the road, ignoring all manner of flashing indicators, until we eventually find ourselves stranded on the roadside. That's from page 39, I believe it was chapter 2 or 3 of the book. And this, what he was going at with this is kind of the setting up the whole safe space classroom, this environment for students to be able to communicate effectively with each other. And he uses this car analogy, and I really like it, because if you just give somebody keys to a car who's never driven before, and you tell them to go to the store for you, they're going to be stranded on the roadside. They're going to crash and burn. But if you practice with the student, set the student up for success, they'll be able to get to the store and back effectively. So that's exactly what we need to do to students when fostering these conversations in the classroom. We need to really set students up for success by effectively moderating and facilitating conversations, as well as if something isn't going right in the classroom and you're getting these warning signs, it's good for the teacher to be redirecting conversation in those paths too, so that students don't lose interest, get upset by the conversation, and stop using their expressive voice and stop wanting to really contribute to the conversation just because they weren't set up correctly and really not given all the tools for success and that stuff that an effective teacher who is trained to do all of this can do.